The Story of Civilization, Volume 4, The Age of Faith, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 3, Side 2. Augustine's initial answer was that Rome had been punished not for her new religion, but for her continued sins. He described the indecency of the pagan stage, and quoted Sallust and Cicero on the corruption of Roman politics. Once Rome had been a nation of Stoics, strengthened by Catos and Scipios. She had almost created law, and had given order and peace to half the world. In those heroic days God had made his face to shine upon her. But the seeds of moral decay lay in the very religion of ancient Rome, in gods who encouraged rather than checked the sexual nature of man. The god Virginius to loose the virgin's girdle, Subigus to place her under the man, Prema to press her down, Priapus, upon whose huge and beastly member the new bride was commanded by religious order to get up and sit. Rome was punished because she worshipped, not because she neglected such deities. The barbarians spared Christian churches and those who fled to them, but showed no mercy to the remnants of pagan shrines. How then could the invaders be the agents of a pagan revenge? Augustine's second answer was a philosophy of history, an attempt to explain the events of recorded time on one universal principle. From Plato's conception of an ideal state existing somewhere in heaven, from St. Paul's thought of a community of saints living and dead, from the Donatist Tychonius's doctrine of two societies, one of God and one of Satan, Augustine took the basic idea of his book as a tale of two cities, the earthly city of worldly men devoted to earthly affairs and joys, and the divine city of the past, present, and future worshippers of the one true God. Marcus Aurelius had provided a noble phrase. The poet could say of Athens, "Thou lovely city of Cecrops," and "Shall not thou say of the world, thou lovely city of God?" But Aurelius had meant by this the whole orderly universe. The Civitas Dei, says Augustine, was founded by the creation of the angels, the Civitas Terrena by the rebellion of Satan. Mankind is divided into two sorts, such as live according to man, and such as live according to God. These we mystically call the two cities or societies, the one predestined to reign eternally with God, the other condemned to perpetual torment with the devil. An actual city or empire need not in all aspects be confined within the earthly city. It may do good things, legislate wisely, judge justly, and aid the church. And these good actions take place, so to speak, within the city of God. This spiritual city, again, is not identical with the Catholic Church. The Church, too, may have terrestrial interests, and its members may fall into self-seeking and sin, slipping from one city into the other. Only at the Last Judgment will the two cities be separate and distinct. By a symbolic extension of her membership to heavenly as well as to earthly souls, to pre-Christian as well as Christian righteous men, the Church may be, and by Augustine occasionally is, identified with the city of God. The Church would later accept this identification as an ideological weapon of politics, and would logically deduce from Augustine's philosophy the doctrine of a theocratic state, in which the secular powers, derived from men, would be subordinate to the spiritual power held by the Church and derived from God. With this book, paganism as a philosophy ceased to be, and Christianity as a philosophy began. It was the first definitive formulation of the medieval mind. 4. The Patriarch. The old lion of the faith was still at his post when the Vandals came. To the end he remained in the theological arena, felling new heresies, countering critics, answering objections, resolving difficulties. He considered gravely whether woman will retain her sex in the next world, whether the deformed and the mutilated, the thin and the fat, will be reborn as they were, how those will be restored who were eaten by others in a famine. But age had come upon him with sad indignities. Asked about his health, he replied, "In spirit I am well, in body I am confined to bed. I can neither walk nor stand nor sit down because of swelling piles. Yet even so, since that is the Lord's good pleasure, what should I say but that I am well?" He had done his best to deter Boniface from rebellion against Rome, and had shared in recalling him to loyalty. As Gaiseric advanced, many bishops and priests asked Augustine should they stay at their posts or flee. He bade them stay and gave example. When the Vandals laid siege to Hippo, Augustine maintained the morale of the starving people by his sermons and his prayers. In the 3rd month of the siege he died, aged 76. He left no will, having no goods, but he had written his own epitaph. "What maketh the heart of the Christian heavy? the fact that he is a pilgrim and longs for his own country. Few men in history have had such influence. Eastern Christianity never took to him, partly because he was thoroughly un-Greek in his limited learning and in his subordination of thought to feeling and will, partly because the Eastern Church had already submitted to the state. But in the West he gave a definitive stamp to Catholic theology. Anticipating and inspiring Gregory VII and Innocent III, he formulated the claim of the Church to supremacy over the mind and the state. And the great battles of popes against emperors and kings were political corollaries of his thought. Until the 13th century, he dominated Catholic philosophy, giving it a Neoplatonic tinge, and even Aquinas the Aristotelian often followed his lead. Wycliffe, Hus, and Luther believed they were returning to Augustine when they left the Church, and Calvin based his ruthless creed upon Augustine's theories of the elect and the damned. At the same time that he stimulated men of intellect, he became an inspiration to those whose Christianity was more of the heart than of the head. Mystics tried to retrace his steps in seeking a vision of God, and men and women found food and phrases for their piety in the humility and tenderness of his prayers. It may be the secret of his influence that he united and strengthened both the philosophical and the mystical strains in Christianity, and opened a path not only for Thomas Aquinas, but for Thomas à Kempis as well. His subjective, emotional, anti-intellectual emphasis marked the end of classical, the triumph of medieval literature. To understand the Middle Ages, we must forget our modern rationalism, our proud confidence in reason and science, our restless search after wealth and power and an earthly paradise. We must enter sympathetically into the mood of men disillusioned of these pursuits, standing at the end of 1,000 years of rationalism, finding all dreams of utopia shattered by war and poverty and barbarism, seeking consolation in the hope of happiness beyond the grave, inspired and comforted by the story and figure of Christ, throwing themselves upon the mercy and goodness of God, and living in the thought of his eternal presence, his inescapable judgment, and the atoning death of his Son. St. Augustine, above all others, and even in the age of Symmachus, Claudian, and Ausonius, reveals and phrases this mood. He is the most authentic, eloquent, and powerful voice of the age of faith in Christendom. 6. The Church and the World. Augustine's argument against paganism was the last rebuttal in the greatest of historic debates. Paganism survived in the moral sense, as a joyous indulgence of natural appetites. As a religion it remained only in the form of ancient rites and customs condoned, or accepted and transformed, by an often indulgent church. An intimate and trustful worship of saints replaced the cult of the pagan gods, and satisfied the congenial polytheism of simple or poetic minds. Statues of Isis and Horus were renamed Mary and Jesus. The Roman Lupercalia and the Feast of the Purification of Isis became the Feast of the Nativity. The Saturnalia were replaced by Christmas celebrations, the Floralia by Pentecost, an ancient festival of the dead by All Souls' Day, the resurrection of Attis by the resurrection of Christ. Pagan altars were rededicated to Christian heroes. Incense, lights, flowers, processions, vestments, hymns, which had pleased the people in older cults, were domesticated and cleansed in the ritual of the Church. And the harsh slaughter of a living victim was sublimated in the spiritual sacrifice of the Mass. Augustine had protested against the adoration of saints, and in terms that Voltaire might have used in dedicating his chapel at Ferney, "Let us not treat the saints as gods. We do not wish to imitate those pagans who adore the dead. Let us not build them temples, nor raise altars to them, but with their relics let us raise an altar to the one God." The Church, however, wisely accepted the inevitable anthropomorphism of popular theology. She resisted, then used, then abused the cult of martyrs and relics. She opposed the worship of images and icons, and warned her faithful that these should be reverenced only as symbols. But the ardor of public feeling overcame these cautions, and led to the excesses that aroused the Byzantine iconoclasts. The Church denounced magic, astrology, and divination, but medieval, like ancient literature, was full of them. Soon people and priests would use the sign of the cross as a magic incantation to expel or drive away demons. Exorcisms were pronounced over the candidate for baptism, and total nude immersion was required lest a devil should hide in some clothing or ornament. The dream cures once sought in the temples of Aesculapius could now be obtained in the sanctuary of Saints Cosmas and Damian in Rome, and would soon be available at 100 shrines. In such matters it was not the priests who corrupted the people, but the people who persuaded the priests. The soul of the simple man can be moved only through the senses and the imagination, by ceremony and miracle, by myth and fear and hope. He will reject or transform any religion that does not give him these. It was natural that amid war and desolation, poverty and disease, a frightened people should find refuge and solace in chapels, churches, and cathedrals, in mystic lights and rejoicing bells, in processions, festivals, and colorful ritual. By yielding to these popular necessities, the Church was enabled to inculcate a new morality. Ambrose, always the Roman administrator, had tried to formulate the ethics of Christianity in Stoic terms, converting Cicero to his needs. And in the greater Christians of the Middle Ages, from Augustine to Savonarola, the Stoic ideal of self-control and uncompromising virtue informed the Christian mold. But that masculine morality was not the ideal of the people. They had had Stoics long enough. They had seen the masculine virtues incarnadine half the world. They longed for gentler, quieter ways by which men might be persuaded to live in stability and peace. For the first time in European history, the teachers of mankind preached an ethic of kindliness, obedience, humility, patience, mercy, purity, chastity, and tenderness, virtues perhaps derived from the lowly social origins of the Church and their popularity among women, but admirably adapted to restore order to a demoralized people, to tame the marauding barbarian, to moderate the violence of a falling world. The reforms of the Church were greatest in the realm of sex. Paganism had tolerated the prostitute as a necessary mitigation of an arduous monogamy. The Church denounced prostitution without compromise and demanded a single standard of fidelity for both sexes in marriage. She did not quite succeed. She raised the morals of the home, but prostitution remained, driven into stealth and degradation. Perhaps to counterbalance a sexual instinct that had run wild, the new morality exaggerated chastity into an obsession, and subordinated marriage and parentage to a lifelong virginity or celibacy as an ideal. And it took the fathers of the Church some time to realize that no society could survive on such sterile principles. But this Puritanic reaction can be understood if we recall the licentiousness of the Roman stage, the schools of prostitution in some Greek and Oriental temples, the widespread abortion and infanticide, the obscene paintings on Pompeian walls, the unnatural vice so popular in Greece and Rome, the excesses of the early emperors, the sensuality of the upper classes as revealed in Catullus and Martial, Tacitus and Juvenal. The Church finally reached a healthier view, and indeed came in time to take a lenient attitude to sins of the flesh. Meanwhile, some injury was done to the conception of parentage and the family. Too many Christians of these early centuries thought that they could serve God best, or rather most easily escape hell, by abandoning their parents, mates, or children, and fleeing from the responsibilities of life in the frightened pursuit of a selfishly individual salvation. In paganism, the family had been the social and religious unit. It was a loss that in medieval Christianity this unit became the individual. Nevertheless, the Church strengthened the family by surrounding marriage with a solemn ceremony and exalting it from a contract to a sacrament. By making matrimony indissoluble, she raised the security and dignity of the wife and encouraged the patience that comes from hopelessness. For a time, the status of woman was hurt by the doctrine of some Christian fathers that woman was the origin of sin and the instrument of Satan. But some amends were made by the honors paid to the Mother of God. Having accepted marriage, the Church blessed abundant motherhood and sternly forbade abortion or infanticide. Perhaps it was to discourage these practices that her theologians damned to a limbo of eternal darkness any child that died without baptism. It was through the influence of the Church that Valentinian I, in 374, made infanticide a capital crime. The Church did not condemn slavery. Orthodox and heretic, Roman and barbarian alike, assumed the institution to be natural and indestructible. A few philosophers protested, but they too had slaves. The legislation of the Christian emperors in this matter does not compare favorably with the laws of Antoninus Pius or Marcus Aurelius. Pagan laws condemned to slavery any free woman who married a slave. The laws of Constantine ordered the woman to be executed and the slave to be burned alive. The Emperor Gratian decreed that a slave who accused his master of any offense except high treason to the state should be burned alive at once, without inquiry into the justice of the charge. But though the Church accepted slavery as part of the law of war, she did more than any other institution of the time to mitigate the evils of servitude. She proclaimed, through the Fathers, the principle that all men are by nature equal, presumably meaning in legal and moral rights. She practiced the principle insofar as she received into her communion all ranks and classes. Though no slave could be ordained to the priesthood, the poorest freedman could rise to high places in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Church repudiated the distinction made in pagan law between wrongs done to a freeman and those done to a slave. She encouraged manumission, made emancipation of slaves a mode of expiating sins, or of celebrating some good fortune, or of approaching the judgment seat of God. She spent great sums freeing from slavery Christians captured in war. Nevertheless, slavery continued throughout the Middle Ages and died without benefit of clergy. The outstanding moral distinction of the Church was her extensive provision of charity. The pagan emperors had provided state funds for poor families, and pagan magnates had done something for their clients and the poor. But never had the world seen such a dispensation of alms as was now organized by the Church. She encouraged bequests to the poor to be administered by her. Some abuses and malversation crept in, but that the Church carried out her obligations abundantly is attested by the jealous emulation of Julian. She helped widows, orphans, the sick or infirm, prisoners, victims of natural catastrophes, and she frequently intervened to protect the lower orders from unusual exploitation or excessive taxation. In many cases, priests, on attaining the episcopacy, gave all their property to the poor. Christian women like Fabiola, Paula, and Melania devoted fortunes to charitable work. Following the example of pagan valetudinaria, the Church or her rich laymen founded public hospitals on a scale never known before. Basil established a famous hospital and the first asylum for lepers at Caesarea in Cappadocia. Xenodochia, refuges for wayfarers, rose along pilgrim routes. The Council of Nicaea ordered that one should be provided in every city. Widows were enlisted to distribute charity and found in this work a new significance for their lonely lives. Pagans admired the steadfastness of Christians in caring for the sick in cities stricken with famine or pestilence. What did the Church do in these centuries for the minds of men? As Roman schools still existed, she did not feel it her function to promote intellectual development. She exalted feeling above intellect, and in this sense Christianity was a romantic reaction against the classic trust in reason. Rousseau was merely a lesser Augustine. Convinced that survival demanded organization, that organization required agreement on basic principles and beliefs, and that the vast majority of her adherents longed for authoritatively established beliefs, the Church defined her creed in unchangeable dogmas, made doubt a sin, and entered upon an unending conflict with the fluent intellect and changeable ideas of men. She claimed that through divine revelation she had found the answers to the old problems of origin, nature, and destiny. "We who are instructed in the knowledge of truth by the Holy Scriptures," wrote Lactantius in 307, "know the beginning of the world and its end." Tertullian had said as much a century before in 197, and had suggested a cloture on philosophy. Having displaced the axis of men's concern from this world to the next, Christianity offered supernatural explanations for historical events, and thereby passively discouraged the investigation of natural causes. Many of the advances made by Greek science through 7 centuries were sacrificed to the cosmology and biology of Genesis. Did Christianity bring a literary decline? Most of the fathers were hostile to pagan literature, as permeated by a demonic polytheism and a degrading immorality. But the greatest of the fathers loved the classics notwithstanding, and Christians like Fortunatus, Prudentius, Jerome, Sidonius, and Ausonius aspired to write verse like Virgil's or prose like Cicero's. Gregory Nazianzen, Chrysostom, Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine outweigh, even in a literary sense, their pagan contemporaries, Ammianus, Symmachus, Claudian, Julian. But after Augustine, prose style decayed. Written Latin took over the rough vocabulary and careless syntax of the popular speech, and Latin verse for a time deteriorated into doggerel before molding new forms into majestic hymns. The basic cause of cultural retrogression was not Christianity, but barbarism, not religion, but war. The human inundations ruined or impoverished cities, monasteries, libraries, schools, and made possible the life of the scholar or the scientist. Perhaps the destruction would have been worse had not the Church maintained some measure of order in a crumbling civilization. "Amid the agitations of the world," said Ambrose, "the Church remains unmoved. The waves cannot shake her. While around her everything is in a horrible chaos, she offers to all the shipwrecked a tranquil port where they will find safety." And often it was so. The Roman Empire had raised science, prosperity, and power to their ancient peaks. The decay of the empire in the West, The growth of poverty and the spread of violence necessitated some new ideal and hope to give men consolation in their suffering and courage in their toil. An age of power gave way to an age of faith. Not till wealth and pride should return in the Renaissance would reason reject faith and abandon heaven for utopia. But if thereafter reason should fail and science should find no answers, but should multiply knowledge and power without improving conscience or purpose, if all utopias should brutally collapse in the changeless abuse of the weak by the strong, then men would understand why once their ancestors, in the barbarism of those early Christian centuries, turned from science, knowledge, power, and pride, and took refuge for 1,000 years in humble faith, hope, and charity. Chapter 4. Europe Takes Form, 325 to 529. 1. Britain Becomes England, 325 to 577. Under Roman rule, every class in Britain flourished except the peasant proprietors. The large estates grew at the expense of small holdings. The free peasant was in many cases bought out and became a tenant farmer or a proletarian in the towns. Many peasants supported the Anglo-Saxon invaders against the landed aristocracy. Otherwise, Roman Britain prospered. Cities multiplied and grew, wealth mounted. Many homes had central heating and glass windows. Many magnates had luxurious villas. British weavers already exported those excellent woolens in which they still lead the world. A few Roman legions in the 3rd century sufficed to maintain external security and internal peace. But in the 4th and 5th centuries, security was threatened on every front. On the north by the Picts of Caledonia, on the east and south by Norse and Saxon raiders, on the west by the unsubdued Celts of Wales and the adventurous Gaels and Scots of Ireland. In 364 to 67, Scot and Saxon coastal raids increased alarmingly. British and Gallic troops repelled them, but Stilicho had to repeat the process a generation later. In 381, Maximus, in 407, usurper Constantine, took from Britain, for their personal purposes, legions needed for home defense, and few of these men returned. Invaders began to pour over the frontiers. Britain appealed to Stilicho for help in 400, but he was fully occupied in driving Goths and Huns from Italy and Gaul. When a further appeal was made to the Emperor Honorius, he answered that the British must help themselves as best they could. In the year 409, says Bede, the Romans ceased to rule in Britain. Faced with a large-scale invasion of Picts, the British leader Vortigern invited some North German tribes to come to his help. Saxons came from the region of the Elbe, Angles from Schleswig, Jutes from Jutland. Tradition, perhaps legend, reports that the Jutes arrived in 449 under the command of two brothers, suspiciously named Hengist and Horsa, that is, stallion and mare. The vigorous Germans drove back the Picts and Scots, received tracts of land as reward, noted the military weakness of Britain, and sent the joyful word to their fellows at home. Uninvited German hordes landed on Britain's shores. They were resisted with more courage than skill. They alternately advanced and retired through a century of guerrilla war. Finally, the Teutons defeated the British at Durham in 577 and made themselves masters of what would later be called Angleland, England. Most Britons thereafter accepted the conquest and mingled their blood with that of the conquerors. A hardy minority retreated into the mountains of Wales and fought on. Some others crossed the Channel and gave their name to Brittany. The cities of Britain were ruined by the long contest. Transport was disrupted, industry decayed. Law and order languished, art hibernated, and the incipient Christianity of the island was overwhelmed by the pagan gods and customs of Germany. Britain and its language became Teutonic. Roman law and institutions disappeared. Roman municipal organization was replaced by village communities. A Celtic element remained in English blood, physiognomy, character, literature, and art, but remarkably little in English speech, which is now a cross between German and French. If we would feel the fever of those bitter days, we must turn from history to the legends of Arthur and his knights, and their mighty blows to break the heathen and uphold the Christ. St. Gildas, a Welsh monk, in a strange book, half history and half sermon, on the destruction of Britain, possibly from 546, mentions a siege of Mons Badonicus in these wars. And Nennius, a later British historian, circa 796, tells of 12 battles that Arthur fought, the last at Mount Badon near Bath. Geoffrey of Monmouth, possibly from 1100 to 1154, provides romantic details, how Arthur succeeded his father Uther Pendragon as King of Britain. opposed the invading Saxons, conquered Ireland, Iceland, Norway, and Gaul, besieged Paris in 505, drove the Romans out of Britain, suppressed at great sacrifice of his men the rebellion of his nephew Mordred, killed him in battle at Winchester, was himself mortally wounded there, and died in the 542nd year of our Lord's incarnation. William of Malmesbury, possibly from 1090 to 1143, informs us that when Vortimer, Vortigern's brother, died, the strength of the Britons decayed, and they would soon have perished altogether had not Ambrosius, the sole survivor of the Romans, quelled the presumptuous barbarians with the powerful aid of the warlike Arthur. Arthur long upheld the sinking state and roused the broken spirit of his countrymen to war. Finally, at Mount Badon, relying on an image of the Virgin which he had affixed to his armor, he engaged 900 of the enemy single-handed and dispersed them with incredible slaughter. Let us agree that it is incredible. We must be content with accepting Arthur as, in essentials, a vague but historical figure of the 6th century, probably not a saint, probably not a king. The rest we must resign to Chrétien of Troyes, the delectable Mallory, and the chaste Tennyson. 2. Ireland, 160 to 529. The Irish believe, and we cannot gainsay them, that their island of mists and mellow fruitfulness was first peopled by Greeks and Scythians 1,000 or more years before Christ, and that their early chieftains, Cuchulainn, Conor, Conall, were sons of God. Himilco, the Phoenician explorer, touched Ireland about 510 B.C. and described it as populous and fertile. Perhaps in the 5th century before Christ, some Celtic adventurers from Gaul or Britain or both crossed into Ireland and conquered the natives, of whom we know nothing. The Celts apparently brought with them the iron culture of Hallstatt and a strong kinship organization that made the individual too proud of his clan to let him form a stable state. Clan fought clan, kingdom fought kingdom for 1,000 years. Between such wars the members of a clan fought one another, and when they died, good Irishmen, before St. Patrick came, were buried upright, ready for battle, with faces turned toward their foes. Most of the kings died in battle or by assassination, perhaps out of eugenic obligation, perhaps as vicars of gods who required first fruits. These ancient kings, according to Irish tradition, had the right to deflower every bride before yielding her to her husband. King Conhober was praised for his especial devotion to his duty. Each clan kept a record of its members and their genealogy, its kings and battles and antiquities, from the beginning of the world. The Celts established themselves as a ruling class and distributed their clans in 5 kingdoms: Ulster, North Leinster, South Leinster, Munster, and Connaught. Each of the 5 kings was sovereign, but all the clans accepted Tara in Meath as the national capital. There each king was crowned, and there at the outset of his reign he convened the Fice, or Convention of the Notables of all Ireland, to pass legislation binding on all the kingdoms, to correct and record the clan genealogies, and to register these in the national archives. To house this assembly, King Cormac MacAirt in the 3rd century built a great hall, whose foundations can still be seen. A provincial council, the Aunach or Fair, met annually or triennially in the capital of each kingdom, legislated for its area, imposed taxes, and served as a district court. Games and contests followed these conventions: music, song, jugglery, farces, storytelling, poetry recitals, and many marriages brightened the occasion, and a large part of the population shared in the festivity. From this distance, which lends enchantment to the view, such a reconciliation of central government and local freedom seems almost ideal. The Fice continued till 560, the Aunach till 1168. The first character whom we may confidently count as historical is Tuathal, who ruled Leinster and Meath about A.D. 160. King Niall, circa 358, invaded Wales and carried off immense booty, raided Gaul, and was killed by an Irishman on the River Loire. From him descended most of the later Irish kings, the O'Neills. In the 5th year of the reign of his son Leary, St. Patrick came to Ireland. Before this time, the Irish had developed an alphabet of straight lines in various combinations. They had an extensive literature of poetry and legend, transmitted orally, and they had done good work in pottery, bronze, and gold. Their religion was an animistic polytheism, which worshipped sun and moon and divers natural objects, and peopled 1,000 spots in Ireland with fairies, demons, and elves. A priestly clan of white-robed druids practiced divination, ruled sun and winds with magic wands and wheels, caused magic showers and fires, memorized and handed down the chronicles and poetry of the tribe, studied the stars, educated the young, counseled the kings, acted as judges, formulated laws, and sacrificed to the gods from altars in the open air. Among the sacred idols was a gold-covered image called the Crom Cruach. This was the god of all the Irish clans. To him, apparently, sacrifice was offered of the firstborn child in every family, perhaps as a check on excessive population. The people believed in reincarnation, but they also dreamed of a heavenly isle across the sea, where there is no wailing or treachery, nothing rough or harsh, but sweet music striking upon the ear, a beauty of a wondrous land whose view is a fair country, incomparable in its haze. A story told how Prince Conall, moved by such descriptions, embarked in a boat of pearl and set out to find this happy land. Christianity had come to Ireland a generation or more before Patrick. An old chronicle, confirmed by Bede, writes under the year 431, Palladius is ordained by Pope Celestin and is sent as their first bishop to the Irish believers in Christ. Palladius, however, died within the year, and the honour of making Ireland unalterably Catholic fell to her patron saint. He was born in the village of Bonaventa in western England, of a middle-class family, about 389. As the son of a Roman citizen, he was given a Roman name, Patricius. He received only a modest education and apologized for his rusticitas, but he studied the Bible so faithfully that he could quote it from memory to almost any purpose. At 16, he was captured by Scot, or Irish, raiders and taken to Ireland, where for 6 years he served as a herder of pigs. In those lonely hours, conversion came to him. He passed from religious indifference to intense piety. He describes himself as rising every day before dawn to go out and pray in whatever weather, hail or rain or snow. At last he escaped, found his way to the sea, was picked up, desolate, by sailors, and was carried to Gaul, perhaps to Italy. He worked his way back to England, rejoined his parents, and lived with them a few years. But something called him back to Ireland, perhaps some memory of its rural loveliness, or the hearty kindliness of its people. He interpreted the feeling as a divine message, a call to convert the Irish to Christianity. He went to Lerins and Auxerre, studied for the priesthood, and was ordained. When news reached Auxerre that Palladius was dead, Patrick was made a bishop, dowered with relics of Peter and Paul, and sent to Ireland in 432. He found there, on the throne of Tara, an enlightened pagan, Leary. Patrick failed to convert the king, but won full freedom for his mission. The Druids opposed him and showed the people their magic. Patrick met them with the formulas of the exorcists, a minor clerical order, whom he had brought with him to cast out demons. In the confessions that he wrote in his old age, Patrick tells of the perils he encountered in his work. 12 times his life was in danger. Once he and his companions were seized, held captive a fortnight, and threatened with death. But some friends persuaded the captors to set them free. Pious tradition tells 100 fascinating stories of his miracles. He gave sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, says Nennius, cleansed the lepers, cast out devils, redeemed captives, raised 9 persons from the dead, and wrote 365 books. But probably it was Patrick's character rather than his wonders that converted the Irish, the undoubting confidence of his belief and the passionate persistence of his work. He was not a patient man. He could dispense maledictions and benedictions with equal readiness. But even this proud dogmatism convinced. He ordained priests, built churches, established monasteries and nunneries, and left strong spiritual garrisons to guard his conquests at every turn. He made it seem a supreme adventure to enter the ecclesiastical state. He gathered about him men and women of courage and devotion, who endured every privation to spread the good news that man was redeemed. He did not convert all Ireland. Some pockets of paganism and its poetry survived and leave traces to this day. But when he died in 461, it could be said of him, as of no other, that one man had converted a nation. Only second to him in the affection of the Irish people stands the woman who did most to consolidate his victory. St. Bridget, we are told, was the daughter of a slave and a king, but we know nothing definite of her before 476, when she took the veil. Overcoming countless obstacles, she founded the Church of the Oak Tree, Kildara, at a spot still so named, Kildare. Soon it developed into a monastery, a nunnery, and a school as famous as that which grew at Patrick's Armagh. She died about 525, honored throughout the island, and 10,000 Irish women still bear the name of the Mary of the Gale. A generation later, St. Ruahan laid a curse upon Tara. After 558, when King Diarmid died, the ancient halls were abandoned, and Ireland's kings, still pagan in culture, became Christian in creed. 3. Prelude to France. 1. The Last Days of Classic Gaul, 310 to 480. Gaul in the 4th and 5th centuries was materially the most prosperous, intellectually the most advanced of Roman provinces in the west. The soil was generous, the crafts were skilled, the rivers and the seas bore a teeming trade. State-supported universities flourished at Narbonne, Arles, Bordeaux, Toulouse, Lyon, Marseille, Poitiers, and Trier. Teachers and orators, poets and sages enjoyed a status and acclaim usually reserved for politicians and pugilists. With Ausonius and Sidonius, Gaul took over the literary leadership of Europe. Decimus Magnus Ausonius was the poet and embodiment of this Gallic Silver Age. He was born at Bordeaux about 310, son of its leading physician. He received his education there, and later told the world in generous hexameters the virtues of his teachers, remembering their smiles and forgetting their blows. In the even tenor of his years, he too became a professor at Bordeaux, taught grammar, that is literature, and rhetoric, that is oratory and philosophy, for a generation, and tutored the future Emperor Gratian. The sincere affection with which he writes of his parents, uncles, wife, children, and pupils suggests a home and a life like that of a 19th-century university town in the United States. He describes pleasantly the house and fields that he inherited from his father, and where he hopes to spend his declining years. He says to his wife in the early years of their marriage, "Let us live always as we live now, and let us not abandon the names that we have given each other in our first love. You and I must always remain young, and you shall always be beautiful to me. We must keep no count of the years." Soon, however, they lost the first child that she gave him. Years later he commemorated it lovingly. "I will not leave you unwept, my firstborn child, called by my name. Just as you were practicing to change your babbling into the first words of childhood, we had to mourn your death. You lie on your great-grandfather's bosom, sharing his grave." His wife died early in their happy marriage after giving him a daughter and a son. He was so deeply bound to her that he never married again, and in his old age he described with fresh grief the pain of his loss and the somber silence of the house that had known the care of her hands and the cadence of her feet. His poems pleased his time by their tender sentiment, their rural pictures, the purity of their Latin, the almost Virgilian smoothness of their verse. Paulinus, the future saint, compared his prose with Cicero's, and Symmachus could not find in Virgil anything lovelier than Ausonius's Mosella. The poet had grown fond of that river while with Gratian at Trier. He describes it as running through a very Eden of vineyards, orchards, villas, and prospering farms. For a time he makes us feel the verdure of its banks and the music of its flow. Then, with all-embracing bathos, he indites a litany to the amiable fish to be found in the stream. This Whitmanesque passion for cataloguing relatives, teachers, pupils, fish, is not redeemed by Whitman's omnivorous feeling and lusty philosophy. Ausonius, after 30 years of grammar, could hardly burn with more than literary passions. His poems are rosaries of friendship, litanies of praise. But those of us who have not known such alluring uncles or seductive professors are rarely exalted by these doxologies. When Valentinian I died in 375, Gratian, now emperor, called his old tutor to him and showered him and his with political plums. In quick succession, Ausonius was prefect of Illyricum, Italy, Africa, Gaul. Finally, at 69, consul. At his urging, Gratian decreed state aid for education, for poets and physicians, and for the protection of ancient art. Through his influence, Symmachus was made prefect of Rome and Paulinus a provincial governor. Ausonius mourned when Paulinus became a saint. The empire, threatened everywhere, needed such men. Ausonius, too, was a Christian, but not too seriously. His tastes, subjects, meters, and mythology were blithely pagan. At 70, the old poet returned to Bordeaux to live another 20 years. He was now a grandfather and could match the filial poems of his youth with the grandparental fondness of age. "Be not afraid," he counsels his grandson, "though the school resound with many a stroke and the old master wears a scowling face. Let no outcry or sound of stripes make you quake as the morning hours move on. That he brandishes the cane for a scepter, that he has a full outfit of birches, is but the outward show to cause idle fears. Your father and mother went through all this in their day, and have lived to soothe my peaceful and serene old age." Fortunate Ausonius to have lived and died before the barbarian flood. Apollinaris Sidonius was to Gallic prose in the 5th century what Ausonius had been to Gallic poetry in the 4th. He burst upon the world at Lyon in 432, where his father was prefect of Gaul. His grandfather had filled the same office, and his mother was a relative of that Avitus who would become emperor in 455, and whose daughter Sidonius would marry in 452. It would have been difficult to improve upon these arrangements. Papianilla brought him as dowry a luxurious villa near Clermont. His life for some years was a round of visits to and from his aristocratic friends. They were people of culture and refinement, with a flair for gambling and idleness. They lived in their country houses, seldom soiled their hands with politics. They were quite incapable of protecting their luxurious ease against the invading Goths. They did not care for city life. Already French and British wealth was preferring the country to the town. In these sprawling villas, some with 125 rooms, all comforts and elegances were gathered. Mosaic floors, columned halls, landscape murals, sculptures in marble and bronze, great fireplaces and baths, gardens and tennis courts, and environing woods in which ladies and gentlemen might hunt with all the glamour of falconry. Nearly every villa had a good library containing the classics of pagan antiquity and some respectable Christian texts. Several of Sidonius's friends were book collectors, and doubtless there were in Gaul, as in Rome, rich men who valued good bindings above mere contents, and were satisfied with the culture they could get from the covers of their books. Sidonius illustrates the better side of this genteel life: hospitality, courtesy, good cheer, moral decency, with a touch of chiseled poetry and melodious prose. When Avitus went to Rome to be emperor, Sidonius accompanied him and was chosen to deliver the welcoming panegyric, this in 456. He returned to Gaul a year later with Avitus deposed, but in 468 we find him in Rome again, holding the high office of prefect of the city amid the last convulsions of the state. Moving comfortably through the chaos, he described the high society of Gaul and Rome in letters modeled upon those of Pliny and Symmachus, and matching them in vanity and grace. Literature now had little to say, and said it with such care that nothing remained but form and charm. At their best, there is in these letters that genial tolerance and sympathetic understanding of the educated gentleman which has adorned the literature of France since the days when it was not yet French. Sidonius brought into Gaul the Roman love for gracious causerie. From Cicero and Seneca, through Pliny, Symmachus, Macrobius and Sidonius, to Montaigne, Montesquieu, Voltaire, Renan, Sainte-Beuve, and Anatole France, is one line, almost by bountiful avatars, one mind. Lest we misrepresent Sidonius, we must add that he was a good Christian and a brave bishop. This book is continued on Cassette 4, Side 1.